You checked your phone 4 minutes ago. There was nothing new then. You know, consciously, with complete certainty, that nothing has changed in the last 4 minutes. No notification sound went off. No vibration occurred. And yet your hand reaches for it again anyway, unlocks the screen, glances briefly, and finds exactly what you already knew you'd find. Nothing. This isn't about needing information. You already had all the information available. This is something stranger and more specific, a physical reflex that has become almost completely disconnected from the actual reason checking a phone originally exists. Most explanations of phone checking behavior focus on what's on the screen, social media, notifications, algorithmic content. What they miss is something more fundamental. In many cases, you're not checking because you expect to find something. You're checking because the checking itself has become an independent behavior, running largely outside any actual expectation of new information. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this happens, the specific psychological mechanism that turns checking into a reflex independent of content, and a concrete way to interrupt it that doesn't rely on willpower alone. Stay until the end, because the last part explains why simply turning off notifications often doesn't fix this, even though most advice assumes it will. Let's start with the mechanism that explains why this behavior persists even without any expectation of reward: intermittent reinforcement. In the 1950s, psychologist B.F. Skinner ran a series of experiments demonstrating something counterintuitive about how reward shapes behavior. Animals that received a reward every single time they performed an action eventually slowed down or stopped performing it once rewards became less frequent or stopped entirely. The behavior was tied closely to a predictable outcome, and when the outcome changed, the behavior adjusted accordingly. But animals that received rewards unpredictably, sometimes after one attempt, sometimes after many, with no consistent pattern, continued performing the action persistently, even long after rewards stopped altogether. Unpredictable reward, it turns out, produces far more durable behavior than predictable reward does. Your phone operates on exactly this kind of unpredictable schedule. Sometimes checking reveals something, a message, a notification, something new. Most of the time, it reveals nothing. Crucially, you can never predict in advance which outcome a given check will produce. This is precisely the structure that produces the most persistent, compulsive behavioral patterns in Skinner's research, and it explains why phone checking, once established, becomes remarkably resistant to simply knowing consciously that nothing is there. Here's the detail most explanations miss. Intermittent reinforcement doesn't just make you more likely to check when you think something might be there. Over enough repetitions, it can make the checking behavior itself become reinforced independently of any specific expectation, because the behavior and the reward have become so tightly and unpredictably linked in your nervous system that the behavior starts running automatically, almost like a motor habit, rather than as a deliberate response to a specific expectation of finding something. This is the key distinction that explains the phantom checking phenomenon. There's a real difference between information-seeking behavior and habituated motor behavior, even though they can look identical from the outside. Information-seeking happens when you have a genuine, conscious expectation that something might have changed. You're waiting for a specific reply, anticipating a specific update. Habituated motor behavior happens when the physical action itself, reaching for the phone, unlocking the screen, glancing at it, has become so repeated and so unpredictably reinforced over time that it executes automatically, triggered by minor cues like boredom, a pause in activity, or simply having a free hand, completely independent of any actual belief that something new is waiting. This explains the specific, confusing experience of catching yourself mid-check with no memory of deciding to check at all. You're not consciously choosing to look for new information in that moment. The behavior is executing on its own, the way a habituated motor pattern does, similar to how you might find yourself biting a nail or tapping a foot without any conscious decision start. There's a second factor that makes this particularly difficult to interrupt: micro-relief. Even when checking reveals nothing new, the brief moment of checking still produces a small reduction in a low-level anxious uncertainty that builds up between checks, a vague sense of what if something happened that I'm missing. This micro-relief, however small, still functions as a form of reward. You're not rewarded with new information most of the time, but you are reliably rewarded with a small decrease in background uncertainty, which is enough to keep reinforcing the behavior even when the explicit content of the check is consistently empty. This is why checking can feel almost soothing in the moment, even when you rationally know there's nothing to find. The relief isn't about discovering anything. It's about briefly resolving an uncertainty your nervous system has been quietly tracking, even if that uncertainty was never particularly significant to begin with. So why doesn't simply turning off notifications solve this, despite being the most common advice given? Because notifications primarily address information-seeking behavior. They reduce the legitimate reasons you might have to check by removing visible cues that something specific has changed, but they do almost nothing to address habituated motor behavior, which by definition doesn't depend on any external cue or specific expectation in the first place. A habituated check happens regardless of whether notifications are on or off, because the trigger isn't the phone signaling something new. The trigger is internal. Boredom, a brief pause, an idle hand, an unconscious motor sequence that's been reinforced so many times it now runs with minimal conscious involvement. This is why many people report turning off all notifications and still finding themselves checking their phone just as frequently, sometimes with genuine confusion about why the intervention didn't work as expected. The intervention addressed the wrong layer of the problem. It removed a cue for information-seeking behavior that, for habituated checking, was never actually the trigger to begin with. So how do you actually interrupt motor-habituated checking, given that it doesn't respond to the most commonly recommended fix? First, introduce friction at the point of the physical action itself, not at the point of content. Habituated behavior is heavily dependent on ease of execution. The same hand motion, the same screen location, performed thousands of times until it requires almost no conscious effort. Physically relocating your phone, changing its position, or adding a small physical barrier disrupts the automaticity of the motor sequence itself, forcing a brief moment of conscious awareness back into a behavior that had become unconscious. Second, name the urge specifically when you notice it, rather than simply executing it. The moment you feel your hand moving toward your phone without a clear reason, pause and silently identify it. This is a habit check, not an information check. This brief act of labeling reintroduces conscious processing into a sequence that's specifically designed to bypass it, which is often enough to interrupt the automatic execution, even temporarily. Third, address the underlying micro-relief mechanism directly, rather than only the checking behavior itself. If checking provides small relief from background uncertainty, find a different brief action that addresses that same underlying restlessness without requiring the phone. A few seconds of conscious breathing, briefly shifting physical posture, or simply tolerating the low-level discomfort directly until it naturally passes, which it reliably does within a short period if not immediately resolved through checking. Fourth, track frequency without judgment for a short period, simply to make the invisible behavior visible. Most habituated checking happens below conscious awareness specifically because it's automatic. Counting or briefly noting each check, even informally, tends to bring a substantial portion of the behavior back into conscious awareness simply through the act of observation, which is often enough to reduce its frequency without requiring any additional intervention at all. Here's what ties this together. You're not checking your phone because you genuinely believe something new is there. In a significant portion of these checks, you're executing a deeply reinforced motor habit built through thousands of repetitions of unpredictable reward that has become almost entirely independent of any actual expectation about content. Understanding this doesn't require more willpower to fix. It requires addressing the actual layer where the behavior is happening, the automatic motor sequence itself, not the information you consciously believe you're looking for. If this explains something you do automatically, tell us in the comments the last time you caught yourself checking your phone with absolutely no reason to. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own everyday behavior, the next video is right there, waiting for you.